So if you look at a written note, there's kind of three parts of the note that I want to talk about. The most important part of the note in terms of naming the pitch is the note head. And that's kind of the circle, whether it's a filled in circle for anything that's a quarter note or shorter, or an open circle for half notes and whole notes and then the brevs if we're going to use those as well. So the note head is going to center on the line or the space of the note that it's going to refer to, right? So when you're identifying the pitch or writing down a pitch, you look at where that note head is positioned, and that gives you the name of the note. So in terms of clarity, I have some examples of note heads on the staff here. You see the line notes, whether they're a filled-in note head or an open note head. Notice how the line really does cut right through the middle of the note head. And in the space note, the note head is fully contained within the space that it's referring to. Okay, and so when we do things this way, then the written pitch will be very, very clear to whomever the reader is. Examples of things we'd want to avoid on line notes, for example. This first red one I've drawn in, you can see how the line does kind of go through the note, but it doesn't go right through the middle of the note, so there's a little bit of ambiguity as to whether or not we're referring to this note, which is a line note, or perhaps a space underneath it, right? So the idea is absolute clarity, so we really want to prefer the ones where the line goes straight through the center of the note. And here's another example of things to be thoughtful of. So here it's a line note where the size is just kind of disproportional to the size of the staff. Again, I think you can make a case that it refers to this line note down here, but could it be this space, right? And then, of course, another one we want to be very, very careful of. Any note that overlaps multiple lines, okay? That's also something we'd want to avoid. The biggest thing to be aware of in terms of space notes is ones that do something like this, where it's a space note, but it sort of kind of edges over that line a little bit, right? It's not the most unclear thing in the world, but one of the things you want to keep in mind when you're writing music, you don't want to leave whomever your reader is to have to guess or sort of, try to use intuition to figure out what you meant, right? You want your meaning to be super, super clear in how you present the note, okay? So be careful with those space notes that sort of kind of encompass a line. And definitely be aware of space notes, especially with open note heads like this, where you can actually see a line going through part of that note, okay? You want it to be unambiguously clear that it's only that space you're referring to on a space note, and in a line note, that line going straight through the center of the note head. So another part of the note is the stem. You'll find a stem on any note that is a half note or shorter. The stem, in terms of its placement, is going to go on one side of the note head or the other. When the stems are going to be pointing up, well, then we put the stem on the right side of the note head. When the stems point down, they go on the left side of the note head. Another part of the note is the flag. You'll see a flag on note values that are an eighth note or smaller, and when they are on their own. The flag will always be attached to the right side of the stem. Here's how they look when the stem is pointed up. And here's how they look when the stem is pointed down. Notice that when the stem is pointed down, the flags are positioned vertically underneath the note head. When you take note values that are eighth notes or smaller and you group them together, we can group them together in what we call beams. So a beam connects the stems between the first and last notes of note values that are grouped together. Of course, the beams go at an angle in many cases, and that angle is typically dictated by the first and last notes of the group. So if the last note of a group is higher than the first note, then the beam will typically slant upward in a way that represents kind of that slope. If the last note of the group is lower than the first note, then usually the beam will slant downward. All right, so when you see flags and beams, sometimes you see one, sometimes you see two or three, right? And whether or not you see two or three flags or two or three beams has everything to do with the actual note value. So the eighth notes, of course, they have one flag or one beam. 16th notes have two flags or two beams, and so on as the note values get smaller. So as I mentioned before, the stem will be on one side of the note head or the other based on whether it's pointing up or down. So how do I decide when it points up and when it points down? Well, the following I'm getting ready to explain happens whenever you have just one voice or one part on a staff. For all notes that appear on the middle line of the staff or higher, the stem is going to point down, so it'll go on the left of the note head. For all notes that are below the middle line of the staff, the stem is going to point up, so it'll be on the right of the note head. Now, when you look at that middle line of the staff, sometimes you'll see the stem pointing up occasionally, but in most cases, we're going to go ahead and point the stem down on the middle line as well as all the notes above. So you'll run into plenty of situations where you have notes that you need to beam, but some of the notes within the beamed groups are below the middle line, other notes are in the middle line or above. So which way do you put the stems when you have a mix of notes above and below the middle line in a group? Well, it turns out that this is a situation where majority rules. So as an example, I'm using this excerpt from a Brandenburg Concerto by Bach, where we've got these notes that are going to be 16th notes by the time I'm done with them, and they are to be beamed in groups of 6. So if I look at the first 6, I can see that 4 of them are below the middle line of the staff, and the last 2 are the middle line or above, right? So because 4 of them are below the middle line, that's going to dictate how I put my stems. So I'll go ahead and beam those 6 with the stems pointed up. And kind of as I do this, you'll see kind of my trick for beaming notes. I start with the first stem, and then I go to the last stem, and I use that to eyeball my angle. Then I go ahead and connect those stems with one of my beams. And in this case, I know I'll need 2 beams, but first let me go ahead and put in the rest of my stems. Make sure they meet that first beam, and then I put in the other beam. So that's how I kind of do my beam notes. So now looking at the next group, now I have all but the last note, which are middle line or above, right? This last note here is below the middle line. So we'll go with the majority in this case and put the stems down. Like so. Now, as we move deeper into music theory, we talk about instances in which we represent multiple voices on a single staff, and the stem conventions do change in those situations. But for now, we'll concern ourselves with representing just a single voice on a single staff.